as we said, Jesus frequently talked about his return, his coming back to this earth. Matthew 24 is a particular chapter in the Bible that talks about these end-time events, because his disciples had a fundamental question. If Jesus had been talking about this, of course they wanted to know when it was going to happen, hadn't they? It's a fair enough question. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" The disciples recognized that this was really important, what Jesus has been talking about, so they were eager to know when these things were going to happen. Of course, we are too. Signs. Don't you just love signs? We see them everywhere, don't we? Everywhere we see signs, particularly in this modern age of health and safety. There's signs telling us everything everywhere. There's even one above the door here, in case there's a fire. Here's one sign here, and there's a good wish message with it as well. But signs are normally there to indicate something, aren't they? And particularly warning signs, the red triangles we often see on the road, aren't they? They're there as a warning. They're there to tell us that something's coming up ahead. There's something happening that we will be coming to very shortly that we need to be prepared for. And if we're not prepared, it presents real danger, doesn't it? Real danger. So, Jesus' reply then to this question from the disciples: when? How? What are the signs? Birth pains. We'll read this verse. "And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Take heed that no one deceives you.'" So the first thing Jesus warns about is there'll be a lot of deception. There'll be a lot of false teaching going on. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and deceive many." People proclaiming the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, false teaching, that's one thing we have to be really careful about. Then Jesus says, "And you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." Okay, well, this phrase here, the beginning of sorrows, what is Jesus talking about? If we go back to the original Greek word, and you'll find Christadelphians do this an awful lot, we go back to the original translation when the New Testament was written in Greek, and we look at that word, Odin, it literally means birth pains. That's the word that was used to describe birth pains. So these things that are going to happen will be like birth pains. They will suddenly kick into place. There's not many people, are there, that don't smile when they see that picture. There's something joyful about it, isn't there? A new birth, a new creation, a new start of life. And he is a little cutie, isn't he? He really is a little cutie. And there's something peaceful, joyous about just seeing him asleep there. Amazing, isn't it? A new creation, a new start. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? But of course, before you can have a beautiful baby like that, there's something that you have to go through first. And it's quite a traumatic experience, isn't it? It's quite an anxious time, a painful time, a very difficult time to go through. And it's quite difficult for the ladies as well, isn't it? I'm sure you would agree. I won't say any more than that. So before that birth, before that lovely, beautiful baby, that new start, there's a very difficult period to go through. And Jesus describes these events as that difficult period. Before, as Phil mentioned earlier, we have this restoration of the world, God's intervention. There's a very difficult period to go through. Birth pains. So let's read it again. And you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end isn't yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of sorrows, or as we've seen, birth pains. So it's important we have a look at this in a bit more detail, isn't it? Because these are the signs, these are the warning signs that Jesus is saying we need to look at, that will indicate we're in the time of the end of the age that he was talking about. So, wars and rumours of wars. What can we draw from that? Well, history has told us that the last century that we've just gone through has been the worst ever for deaths caused by wars. It'd be nice to think that as mankind, his time on the earth grew, that he would become more compassionate to his fellow man. But the evidence is, the historical evidence is, that he hasn't. And in the last century, that has shown us that warfare has caused more deaths than ever. The worrying concern is, as technology has increased and the damage man can do to each other has increased, that possibly at some time in the future could get worse. And there's a lot of concern about a nuclear arms race in the Middle East at the moment, as Iran toys with the world over its nuclear plan. So history is not in favour that we're in a decline period of warfare at all. What it tells us is that warfare and death by warfare is very active indeed. Famines. These sort of pictures are probably quite familiar to most of us. We've had some shocking famines since the 80s, where we had Live Aid, where the world was galvanised by the pictures they saw on their TVs. They were galvanised into action to try and help and assist and prevent these sort of things going on. Millions were raised, weren't they? And charities are working hard to reduce the impact of famine, but it's still happening, isn't it? We've got the Horn of Africa at the moment, particularly suffering with famine. Famines caused by natural disaster, famines caused by warfare, by corruptness of governments that won't release funds to feed their own nations. It's still very active in the world today. Pestilences, we're talking about disease here and plagues and things like that. Now, it would be nice to think with the advances of modern medicine that these are slowly being brought under control. And certainly in Western society, it certainly has. There's been massive steps to control disease and plague. But that's not the case in the majority of the world. It's still a huge problem. AIDS, particularly in Africa, where they don't have access to the drugs that we do over here for whatever reason. They can't get the drugs, so there's a lot of problem with AIDS in Africa and other countries. There's other viruses that, again, where people haven't got access to the medication, they're still in plague-type proportions. And the real concern, though, and we've seen a bit of a wake-up with that, with recent scares about bird flu and other things, is that with our modern society and the fact that our movement across the world is so rapid and fast through flights and various things, and particularly flights, that if we do have a disease mutate, so the gestation period is very rapid, so it is passed on before the symptoms really show, that we could be in really big trouble. And we've seen concerns about that in recent years. So it's certainly got the potential there, hasn't it? And then we look at earthquakes. Now, earthquakes is a real interesting one, because earthquakes are very specific, and they can be recorded very accurately and in detail. So it's very useful for us to look at earthquakes, and we've seen in recent years some phenomenal footage, haven't we, on our TVs of earthquakes and what they cause, particularly tsunamis. I believe probably most of us were left speechless, weren't we, when we saw those tsunamis after the great earthquake in Japan. This year, it was only this year, back in March. Phenomenal destruction. So when Jesus talks about birth pains, we need to sort of link up these events in the mindset of pregnancy and giving birth. And it's a useful exercise to do that. Now, we're pretty familiar that from conception, it's roughly about 38 weeks before that lovely baby appears, isn't it? And over that period, there's a steady growth in the baby's length, but also in the baby's weight, and the discomfort that causes generally increases as time goes on. However, once labour contractions begin, delivery is very rapid, isn't it? Compared with the pregnancy period of 38 weeks, once those contractions kick in, that baby is on the way and nothing's going to stop it. Very rapid. And they say that the average labour lasts, this is information that's been given to me, 3 to 8 hours. Average labour. Obviously the first labour, the first child is a lot longer, generally, and generally the more babies you have, the shorter it becomes. And in many parts of the world where they have a lot of babies, the 5th, 6th, 7th come very quickly indeed, so I am told. So, average 3 to 8 hours. And during this period, things really ramp up, don't they? The contractions increase significantly, the strength increases, but also the frequency. So we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at these end-time prophecies. Increase in strength and frequency. This is where it gets really interesting. Luke's Gospel, which also reports this teaching that Jesus gave his disciples when they asked when, Luke describes it as there will be great earthquakes. Not just earthquakes, but great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs from heaven. Okay. Here we go then. This is taken from a site, nothing to do with Bible prophecy. Because earthquakes are so significant, certainly the destructive ones, there are good, accurate records about them. And the experts tell us that over the last 2,000 years, the most destructive earthquakes have been in the last 500 years. And again, since 2,000 years, there's been a gradual increase. But most of them have been in the last 500 years. If we zoom in on that, this is the last 30 years, we can see again that earthquakes of a magnitude of 8 or greater have increased in the last 10 years. So these are sizable earthquakes, 8 and above, they're real whoppers, earthquakes. Now, I'm going to do a little exercise here. We're going to go onto the internet live. Ooh, just kneel down, and I'll talk you through what we're going to do. Here we go. This is a website that collates all this data, nothing to do with Bible prophecy. Puts all this data nicely into graphs. And if we go in and look at some historical activity for the last 30 years, these are for +6 magnitude earthquakes. So these are significant earthquakes. These are ones that people generally notice. 6 and above, this is. So we've got a general trend around about 40 to 60, and then about 10 years ago things started to increase a little bit. But recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen quite a significant rise in these earthquakes. And the last figure there that was plotted, 2010, was 160 plus 6 magnitude earthquakes. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want us to go live on the internet and collect the latest data on plus 6 earthquakes. We'll go to a USA site now to get the data, and we'll do a search live on the internet. Anybody can do this. And we'll gather the figures for this complete last year. So if we use today's date, but back in 2010, we got December the 1st. And if we finish today, December the 1st, and we're only really interested in significant earthquakes, so we'll go again for plus 6, so we're 6 minimum, maximum is 9.9, which is the biggest you can get on the Richter scale. We'll do our search. Here we go. So this is for plus 6 earthquakes. A bit hard to see for you, but that is the figure there. 208 earthquakes for the last year. So if we go back to our graph, where does 208 leave us? Just about there. So I think it's fair to say that something significant is happening. It's certainly something that we need to keep a close eye on. And if we start to see in the news a lot of discussion being generated about why are all these earthquakes happening, what's the underlying cause, we know something really is starting to kick in. Back to our presentation. Jesus goes on to say, after these early warning signs, he's talking to his disciples, he's talking to the Jews, then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. So we've got Jews here and Christians. And at that time, many will turn away from the faith and betray each other and hate each other. Again, another warning, many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. So we've been talking about God's hand at work through blessings and persecution. Jesus is indicating here that a difficult time will also come for the Jewish nation. It's not a green light all the way for their prosperity and their security. So even the Jewish nation will come into a very difficult time. Also, will Christians come into a very difficult time? And again, this warning again about false teachers, false assurances being given. Through this series, we'll be looking at that in more detail. Because of the increase in wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So there'll be an increase in wickedness. But assurance from Jesus is that those that stand firm in their faith will be saved. And the kingdom will be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come. Then Jesus moves on to something really quite specific, an important event. This is where he says you've really got to sit up and take note. When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So it's a really significant event going on here. That those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So in the land of Israel, Jesus is saying, get out. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, never to be equaled again. It's a very difficult period in the world at this time. Let the reader understand. Okay. So that is a key indicator, and we need to look at that in due course. Again, another warning from Jesus. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. So when it looks like the end of the world is upon us, God will intervene. Those days will be cut short by him sending the Lord Jesus Christ. So it will not be the end of the world. We're not doomsdayers. God will intervene and send his Son, the Lord Jesus. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all peoples of the earth will mourn, similar language again, when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. So the great and glorious return of the Lord Jesus Christ at that time. To recap then, we're told these signs that Jesus is going to give us are like birth pains. They'll suddenly kick in. They'll suddenly escalate. And it will tell us that the Lord Jesus Christ will soon be here. During those times, or after those times, when that escalation takes place, there'll be a persecution of believers, whether in Israel or elsewhere perhaps. One key indicator is the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by the prophet Daniel. There'll be a very difficult period, very difficult, anxious period, a bit like, again, childbirth for the world. Other places in the Bible it calls it great tribulation. Without God's intervention, no one would survive. And at that time, apocalyptic type events will be taking place. But before all hope is lost, we will see the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Before we go there, okay, so that's quite a lot of information that will come over to you. What I'd like us to do now is to watch a video clip that will just underline what we've been talking about. We can have the lights down, please.
Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away. When his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings, "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is out in the desert," do not go out. Or, "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other.